It's been nearly a year since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. The group says the nation is moving forward, but millions of people are hungry. Many girls aren't in school, and few countries recognize the Taliban's leadership. So what's needed to turn things around? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. The Taliban's swift return to power in Afghanistan a year ago caught many by surprise. The group captured a string of cities as US-led foreign forces left the country after 20 years. And when its fighters took over the presidential palace on August 15th, President Ashraf Ghani went into exile, conceding the Taliban has won. Tens of thousands of Afghans and foreigners scrambled to Kabul airport to board those last flights out. Taliban leaders promised to be more moderate and said they were committed to respecting women's rights. But 12 months on, most girls are still banned from school. Females have limited rights to work or travel without a male guardian. And Afghanistan's economy has nearly collapsed, with foreign aid drying up. Speaking exclusively to Al Jazeera, a senior Taliban leader called for more international support.
It has been only 1 year since we assumed power, and the world should not expect us to achieve all our goals overnight. It is next to impossible, especially when the international community has not fulfilled promises, including recognition of our rule and foreign aid. Despite the delay on their part, we, by the grace of God, achieved huge progress on many fronts.
Well, Afghanistan's economic crisis has worsened its already dire humanitarian situation. Nearly 1 million Afghans have lost or been forced from their jobs since the Taliban took over. According to the World Food Programme, 90% of Afghans have faced food shortages over the past year. The World Bank says the prices of consumer products such as diesel, flour, rice and sugar have increased 50% since last year. Afghanistan has $9 billion in reserves, but they're held in the US and Europe. And that's because the international community refuses to recognize the Taliban government. Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Kabul, we have Muska Gailani. She's the acting director of the Afghanistan Women Council. And in London is Graeme Smith. He's a senior consultant on Afghanistan for International Crisis Group. He's also the author of The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan. A warm welcome to you both. Muska, I want to start with you because you're sitting in Kabul at the moment. After what we heard from the Taliban a year ago, all those promises, are you surprised by what life is like there now?
First of all, I would like to say hello to our panel member. When you ask me if I'm surprised, absolutely not. I am not surprised the way the situation of the country is right now. The past year's experience has shown that the Taliban have not only remained unchanged, but they also act with far more extreme ideology bias to deprive freedoms and sabotage the foundations of national unity in Afghanistan. There's open oppression against women, depriving them from their rights, taking away the rights from children and youth of this country of education, and along with it, topping it all up with ethnic discrimination. They had promised far more different things, but they have not at all come across into fulfilling any of those promises, unfortunately. And it just feels like all those promises were lies. I mean, all that we see or have seen in the past 1 year are all examples of their fanatic and radical thinking, which is truly, according to me, bizarre.
Muska, one of the big promises that they made was obviously around women's rights, about allowing women to continue working, going to school especially. And obviously back in March, they stopped most girls from being allowed to go to secondary school. Graeme, I'm curious because at the beginning of the Taliban taking power, they were very keen to reassure the international community, and they wanted legitimacy, they wanted aid. Why did they make this decision in March?
Well, yeah, I was there in Doha on the sidelines of the negotiations where the Taliban were trying to reassure the international community, as you say. But I think it's worth going back and looking at what exactly they promised, because even though they were trying to indicate that they are ready to have peaceful relations with the outside world and even sort of courting foreign investment, they were always very careful to say that what they call domestic issues, issues of social policy, for example, in which they're extremely conservative, that these are things that the outside world should not interfere with. And so I feel, I've never myself, used this phrase Taliban 2.0 that you sometimes hear, because in my view, the Taliban have always been the Taliban. And so there is actually a fair bit of consistency between what they said earlier and what they're doing now. You're right, though, that there was a kind of turning point in March when the Taliban decided to officially bar girls from secondary schools. Now, of course, in about half the provinces or so, girls are actually attending secondary schools, but officially across the country, that ban remains in place. And, I think that was a moment where you saw the emir and circles around the emir, the supreme leader down in Kandahar, really trying to assert themselves within the movement. And so 1 year into the evolution of the Taliban regime, it's still very much a work in progress in terms of who's in control and how it all works.
Well, given the splits then that we're seeing within the Taliban themselves, Muska, let me ask you, is this causing division on the ground within communities?
Within communities, no, because when you look at it as communities, they all want the same thing in the end of the day. I think there are different ideas and there are different ideologies or different decisions is only putting them among themselves, like in trouble, and making them not get along among each other, which is, again, really surprising to like, it does not make sense to any of us. Why they fought for 20 years and then they come back and all their focus is on being just strict towards women. And that's all that they have been doing. And they have paid absolutely no attention to the economic crisis that's been that this country has been dealing with. So I think if you look at it like from a step back, the entire community, all the communities in Afghanistan, they all want the same thing. So no, it does not really divide them. It just puts them in a lot of concern.
Sure, I want to get to the economic concerns and the situation there in a moment, but this whole situation with girls going to school and this ban on girls going to secondary school, this has had huge implications for aid. So Muska, as someone who works with women in Afghanistan, I'm curious about your personal opinion. Do you think foreign donors should be withholding aid until the Taliban changes its policy on women and girls?
I personally think no, because it's not helping. The government is not breaking. The help is not coming. The only people suffering in the middle are the women that we personally have been working with, or all the women, as a matter of fact. I mean, which part of women being on the roads begging is better than like getting no aid? Like, it makes no sense. So I think no. I think the international community should actually send in their donations, but maybe not through the government, because honestly, in my opinion, this government should not be recognized.
Graeme, sorry, I want to bring Graeme in here as well, because I know you have called for aid to be released, and obviously Western governments don't want to look like they are supporting the Taliban. How is this now being discussed in Western capitals?
Yeah, my organization, the International Crisis Group, was one of the sort of earliest to come out publicly last fall and say, look, this is not going to work. There are a lot of hungry people in Afghanistan. And so it's probably time to start thinking about unfreezing the frozen assets, about lifting some of the Western economic restrictions, especially easing the effects of sanctions. And to their credit, actually, Western actors, especially the United States, have been taking steps in that direction. I mean, this spring, we saw something called General License 20 from the U.S. Treasury Department. That's actually the most sweeping set of exemptions from U.S. sanctions anywhere in the world. So there have been this kind of effort to ease the blow a little bit, but it's still very much a work in progress. Those assets remain frozen, as you mentioned at the top of the show. And those negotiations are continuing between the United States and the Taliban about the future of central banking, which sounds like a boring topic, but it's just vital to how Afghans eat There needs to be cash liquidity on the streets so that import deals can get done, so that daily bread can reach Afghan bakeries.
So, well, let's talk about what that looks like on the streets of Kabul. Muska, you alluded to the economic crisis there. What does a regular day look like at the moment?
The regular day, it's disappointing, it's painful, and it's heartbreaking. Those are all that I can say. But behind every bread bakery that you see, there are 20 to 25, 30 women just sitting there waiting for someone to give them a piece of bread. That's what's happening. Children are out on the streets begging all day long. Most of these women were the only breadwinners of their family, since their husbands or brothers or fathers have been killed or died or all during these 20 years of war. So they were the main breadwinners. And now a daily normal day in Kabul or in Afghanistan overall looks like this sad tragedy where women are out with their hands out begging for 10 AFs, 20 AFs, a piece of bread, a little bit of food so they could go back home and feed their children. That's what it looks like.
Well, we keep talking about food security, and I recall last winter we were talking very much about the possibility of a famine in Afghanistan going into the lean season. It does seem that somehow that was staved off. Graeme, how did that actually happen? And obviously there's winter coming again this year, but what is the situation like at the moment?
I mean, it was staved off just barely. The United Nations says that upwards of 20,000 people in the Central Highlands are now in what they call famine-like conditions. That's sort of the very worst kind of starvation-like category. And I think there's a real fear that could spread as we get towards winter. Afghanistan, of course, produces a lot of its own food in the harvest seasons. And then when you get towards winter, it depends a lot more on imports. Those imports are now more expensive globally, partly because of the war in Ukraine, and partly because of the paralysis in the banking sector. It's very hard for food importers to bring food into the country like they did before. And some of the blockages to trade are resulting in higher prices for ordinary Afghans. As you noted, just terrible inflation, not just in the price of food, but the price of fuel, the prices of medicine. And so there really does have to be some greater action in terms of reaching some sort of agreement between the West and the Taliban on how economic revival is going to be achieved.
Muska, correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that there is food to be bought in the market, so it is available. It's just that people don't have the money to buy it. And I know there have been some issues about salaries being paid. So can you give us an idea of just how big that gap is between the price of food and what people can actually afford?
Well, the price of food has gone really high, of course. But the thing is that currently half of the people or women that were working, since I come and I am basically representing the women right now, but the women used to work and now they have been fired from their jobs. So they're not really getting salaries. And if they were the breadwinners, it's really hard. So that gap is like really, really, really big. I mean, I really don't know how this is gonna change. Because also the donations that so far have come in to help the people who are dealing with such issues, it has only made Afghanistan look like a charity case, and that's not what we want. We want something stable. We want something for everyone to have their rights, the right to work, right to education, right to just equal rights for men and women. Currently, most men are not being paid. Most of their salaries are not given. So, I mean, people literally don't have money to go and buy and enough for their families. So they're dealing with quite a hard time right now.
Some of the most extreme needs that we've been seeing are in rural areas as well. So many people, though, outside Kabul just wanted the fighting to stop. So now we're seeing this relative peace at the same time as economic challenges are mounting. Graeme, how are people outside Kabul viewing the Taliban now, given this kind of dichotomous situation they're in?
Well, as you mentioned, shutting millions of girls out of high schools really hasn't helped the Taliban's reputation. I think the discovery of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri living in the heart of Kabul also damaged the Taliban's reputation globally. And so it gets harder under those conditions for the Taliban to reach any kind of agreement about how to get beyond just sort of short-term emergency relief, which is neither, sustainable nor sufficient to deal with the tens of millions of Afghans who are now on the brink of starvation. What the World Bank has said is that we need to start investing in development. That, for example, there is less area under effective irrigation today than there was in the 1970s. It's a primarily agricultural economy, so there needs to be help with getting water to crops. But who is going to come in and build a large-scale irrigation system under a Taliban regime that is not recognized by the international community, and with that sort of political distance growing? And so it really is a difficult situation.
Graeme, I really want to focus on how people in rural areas particularly are feeling as well, because I know you've travelled around the country in the last few months or so, and I'm curious about how people who were really just wanting the fighting to stop, how they're feeling now that they're faced with the Taliban regime, even though there is a now relative security.
Yeah, I just finished working with colleagues on a report about the security situation based on interviews in 13 out of the 34 provinces. A lot of people in rural areas are benefiting from the end of the war, essentially. There are two small insurgencies remaining, one against remnants of the former republic in the north, and one against the local version of the Islamic State in the east. But these are really small-scale conflicts. And, this had been the deadliest war on the planet Earth. We had 30,000 to 40,000 people dying annually in the conflict, hundreds of thousands displaced. And so, in a lot of the rural villages, people are putting their lives back together. They're picking up the pieces, literally. Some of the biggest threats to civilians in those areas are when children pick up the explosive remnants of war. They're foraging for scrap metal, or they're playing with the shiny bits of metal, and something explodes. And so far too many children, unfortunately, are dying in the remnants of this terrible conflict.
Muska, you're sitting in Kabul. Do you feel like there's still a huge, huge difference between how people feel in the capital versus in the rural areas, particularly now that the security situation has changed?
Honestly, I think right now everyone is starving, be it the capital, be it the rural areas. Everyone's focus is to have their tummies filled, food on their table. Security, it does not feel secure. So what's the point of this kind of a security? Okay, yes, we're not having explosions the way we used to, but they were the ones who were doing the explosions themselves. So, that is not that big of a good news that, explosions or the security has gotten better. But right now, as the whole nation right now is starving, and that's their biggest issue right now at hand. If you really think about it, what good does this security bring if they're all starving and are dealing with depression or anxiety or 100 other issues that they face on daily basis? Well,
amid all the criticism that the Taliban's received, they've said that their big focus has been on security. And Graeme, as you alluded to there, they are still fighting a number of groups, including ISIL. What do you think their focus is now? Are they being distracted by military operations? Are they wanting to focus on the economic situation?
The Taliban are in the middle of consolidating control, both militarily and economically. Yes, as you say, they are still struggling against some, you could call them insurgent groups. They are actually gaining the upper hand against these pockets of resistance, but they do continue. Economically, they have dismantled some of the checkpoints. When you drive around the highways, some of the places where the police used to shake down truck drivers, those places simply don't exist anymore. And some very careful satellite-based work examining flows through customs houses has shown that the Taliban have cleaned up more than $1 billion a year of corruption that occurred during the last government. And so there is now today a greater percentage of the money being handed over at customs points is going to the central treasury. So that helps the Taliban to mitigate some of the economic damage. But we're talking about an economy that has shrunk considerably. And so overall, even though the Taliban are consolidating some of their power economically and militarily, it is just a situation of lower demand. And so it's very difficult for them to navigate that.
You were speaking about them consolidating power. There are still splits within the Taliban, and obviously you alluded also to the previous government. I wonder whether there have been revenge killings. That one of the biggest promises that they made in August was that there would be an amnesty for people from the previous government, that these revenge killings wouldn't take place, that there would be freedom of the media as well. Muska, can you give us a sense of the sentiment there? You're obviously comfortable speaking to us openly now. What does that say about the situation?
Maybe I'm just a little brave and I like taking risks. That's why I am saying the way, or speaking rather, the way that I am. But media is extremely controlled. They're not allowed to, it's very restricted for them. They cannot say everything on the news. It's everything is monitored by the Taliban. So a lot of what you see on the news, it's probably filtered, and unfortunately, and that's just how it is. Me speaking the way that I am is just that my heart aches way too much to care about anything happening to me, because my country is falling apart, and it breaks my heart. I cannot just sit here and say, I wish this happened, I wish that happened. I'm going to say it as it is. This is barbaric, cruel behavior towards the people of this nation as a whole. So,
Graeme, let me bring you in briefly on that. How would you assess how genuine that amnesty offer was, and the state of the freedom of the press there now?
Well, the amnesty offer was a great propaganda coup by the Taliban, because that was partly, I think, why their enemies were willing to put down their guns in many provinces, because the Taliban promised not to kill them. It's been enforced unevenly. The United Nations and Human Rights Watch and other organizations have identified dozens, in some cases more than 100 violations of the amnesty. People have been killed, people have been dragged out of their homes. It's worth noting, though, that really this has been one of the most peaceful changes of regime in the recent turbulent decades of Afghan history. I mean, the last time there was, when the Taliban were swept out of power, there were mass killings, mass graves in the desert. And we just have not seen that kind of thing. Although, it's difficult to tell from a distance, because exactly as you say, media reporting has been more restricted. Afghanistan is falling down the rankings of media freedom. And just, in the last 24 hours, I was receiving messages about colleagues who were jailed while trying to photograph and film women's protesters in the streets. Now, they were eventually released, but I was very worried about them for a few hours. And, it's not something that you would have seen under the previous government.
Muska, you're sitting in Kabul, and I want to give you the last say. As a young woman in Afghanistan right now, knowing the context of what's going on, what is your personal message to the Taliban?
My personal message would be that we are not demanding anything extraordinary. We just want our basic rights given to us, both to women and men. We just want that humanity or the basic rights given to us, and for it to be restored. We're currently the only country where girls are not going to school. And I think that's crazy in the 21st century. Basic rights, just give us the basic rights to education, healthcare, and just be nice to your people. In the end of the day, we're all Afghans, and we all just want to live in a peaceful country where we all work together to build it into a better place to be. That's all I can ask for.
Well, thank you for your message, Muska, and thank you for joining us, Muska Gailani and Graeme Smith. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.